The original Hellraiser is a masterpiece of horror. It shows off some incredible technical achievements and introduces us to compelling characters with interesting dramas that provide a cohesive narrative that supports the horror elements and pushes boundaries due to the extreme nature of the subject. While the reboot does a commendable job, it fails to avoid the tedious pitfalls of conventional horror storytelling and becomes a bit more work to watch than fun. In this video, we will be going over Clive Barker's original movie, talking about its themes, the big moments that make it such a classic, and comparing it directly to this modern reboot.
Grant me this audience.
Hellraiser is centered around a new beginning for an estranged family. The father, Larry, moving his new wife, Julia, into a new home, while his daughter, Kirsty, visits and tries to help them settle in. Only to discover the relationship with her stepmother is uncomfortable. Here we are introduced to a mixture of themes regarding sexuality and lust and the struggle of family almost immediately. Julia is catcalled by one of the movers, both of them sweaty, dirty men making suggestive comments, informing us that Julia is portrayed as a woman of affluence and only exists to attract the attention of men. Her lustful presence is fully explored when we learn that she had a passionate love affair with her husband's brother, Frank. It is this explosive affair which motivates the entire movie. The drama alone is enough to keep us invested in what happens next. Julia's character is a natural source of tension as she remembers her cravings for Frank, and her plight becomes a reflection of reality and how we lust after one another. This all dances around the core themes of Hellraiser and what a majority of Clive Barker's work discusses regarding the obsessive nature of man's quest for the flesh, a common thread explored in other body horror. The works of David Cronenberg often center around this idea as well, and there's great insight into our own primordial brain that makes these stories resonate for all time. It should be noted how this movie uses its visuals and music to guide our thoughts, and we do not need to rely on the characters talking out loud to express what they think. The greatest expression of all is a marvelous sequence of gore and mystery when Frank's body is resurrected from a simple drop of blood hitting the floorboards. We watch as the fibers of his body reform from primordial goo, brought to us in glorious stop motion, and it's one of the most gripping moments ever put on film. In his grotesque form, feeble and desperate, he uses Julia's lust to convince her to help him regenerate by feeding him more flesh from other people. This begins the second act as we witness Julia go out and attract men to come home with her. She then proceeds to hit them with a hammer and leave their twitching, confused bodies to literally be drunk by Frank's gross half-muscle baby body. This all happens underneath a regular family structure as Larry carries on as if nothing is wrong, trying to live the good life as a father and a husband. The irony is what makes Hellraiser compelling. We understand everything because of good filmmaking that shows us the pieces that we need to know and only drives us forward with dialogue when it is absolutely necessary. Frank pleading with Julia to give him victims to feed on feels natural as he is so raw and vulnerable. He has no choice but to give us a directive.
Please, God, help me!
Julia's choice to help him reinforces the pre-established themes and gives further insight into her character as we realize she's just as fucked up and evil as any of the creatures we are introduced to at the end of the movie. This is just a well-written plot at this point, shown to us with simple scenes that express underlying themes and when stitched together create some meaning. That's a neat trick, right? Well, I'm bringing it up on purpose because it'll be important later. As Frank becomes more human and Julia gets more and more wrapped up in her devious feeding ritual, Kirsty just so happens to witness one of Julia's victims getting brought into her dad's house. It is here she bears witness to the horrors that have been happening under her father's nose, and it is here she also happens to come into possession of the cube. Speaking of the cube, let's stop here for a second and go back to the beginning. The opening scene of the movie is where we first see the cube. We watch as Frank buys the cube from a street smuggler, plays with it, and then has his flesh ripped apart by chains. This sequence is very brief and ominous, but we do not really see the cube again for another 40 minutes as Frank is describing what the cube does to Julia, followed by Kirsty grabbing it when she discovers Frank, and Frank tries to grab her. Sorry, there's a lot of grabbing going on, but Kirsty wakes up after getting away and she's in a psych ward and now has the cube, which is basically a huge deal in the film's lore as it is the key that allows for all of this to happen. Okay, we're all caught up, we're good. Kirsty has the cube, Frank is almost a half man, and Julia has been outed as this terrible person who only wants to get her lusty Frank back. Larry doesn't really know anything's going on as he might be in complete denial, trying trying to excuse his wife's behavior as a sickness or adjustment pains, completely oblivious to anything other than, my wife won't have sex with me after moving her into this old house. So this begins the third act, and this is where the movie really starts to boil over. Kirsty messes with the cube while being held against her will at the hospital and makes contact with the Cenobites, who tell her they want Frank back because they're kind of pissed that he got away, and Kirsty doesn't know what's going on at all. She's literally being dropped into this situation, and it's pretty nightmarish and fucked up, so her bewilderment is super understandable since she's had a fairly conventional existence up to this point. I really want to point out the fact that she is dealing with a new situation for the rest of the movie, and it gives her behavior a bit of an excuse. This movie does a great job of establishing her mental condition, going from a plucky, earnest, budding adult to her first encounter with fleshy Frank. It does a great job of showing the cause and effect of her duress. As a result, we understand and can relate to her condition. It gives her ethos, and we are on her side as we hope for her to be okay. After learning what her stepmother is doing, the danger her father is in, only to be imprisoned by a bureaucratic system, then she walks into another dimension full of demons. Like, I am totally relating to her experience as I'm witnessing it, since she's a reasonable person who's been in reasonable situations this whole time, only now witnessing some of the most unimaginable things. Am I rambling here? Does this make sense? She's fucking stressed out, and we understand why. That's the point I'm getting at. It's important for later, trust me. Okay, so Kirsty agrees to help the Cenobites with the hope that this is what she has to do to save herself and her dad, and it's kind of all messy, and she's just scrambling to get by. Meanwhile, Julia has finally agreed to let Frank murder Larry, his own brother by the way, so that Frank can take the final form and usurp Larry's position by wearing Larry's skin. So they murder Larry. Larry, I should also say, gets completely fucked over in this movie, and it's kind of tragic, but only slightly, because Larry had to lie to himself every day for like a month while this was all going on. So you could make the argument that Larry might embody all of us who sit here and isolate ourselves from reality to try to find happiness in all the mundane, regular shit we do day in, day out, trying to earn love and be respected, even if that is a frail coating for our egos. But most of us don't get our skin stolen for living like this. It could be argued that Larry is a fool, and if he had any agency or control over his own life, he could have avoided being betrayed by simply being honest with himself. But that's another essay I'm not getting into right now. So Frank is now Larry, and Julia is full-blown fucked and drunk on her lusting, and now the true evil narrative romance is completed, and we now get to bear witness to this nightmare unraveling as everyone gets what they deserve. Kirsty breaks free from the hospital only to return home and find Frank in Larry's skin, but it takes her a minute to realize what has happened to her dad and that her situation is pretty bleak. Julia and Frank, should I call him Skin Daddy? No? Okay. Well, they try to murder Kirsty so they don't have to deal with anyone revealing the secret, but Frank ends up stabbing Julia instead, and it seems kind of intentional in that Frank is just using Julia to get back to doing what Frank wanted to do as a living human again.
Nothing personal, babe.
Which adds another layer to these themes about sex driving us to our undoing, and it's just twisted bit of evil sprinkled into everything. Kirsty is chased and stalked through the house by a series of horrifying moments. Cenobites emerge after she baits Frank, Larry's Skin Daddy, back into the attic, and here we get a magnificent sequence where Pinhead rips Frank into pieces in an absolutely incredible moment that basically makes this movie what it is.
Jesus wept.
Climax having been achieved, the movie quickly resolves itself as Kirsty has to dispel the remaining Cenobites using the cube as a weapon to cast them out of this dimension. It's a really fun sequence using some dated but charming effects, and it does a great job of swooping us from Act 4 into our conclusion, which we find Kirsty and random boyfriend. I didn't mention him because he just sort of reinforces the sex themes, as he and Kirsty hook up at one point, but then he kind of turns into a person that's just there, so it's not really important to the main plot, staring at a field of fires only to have the cube swooped up from a winged demonic creature that returns the cube to the original vendor who we saw in the beginning, and it's implied that the cycle of punishment will continue. The end. Until they decide to make 10 sequels that are all terrible. But the original movie stands as a masterpiece of horror because of its coherent themes, skilled filmmaking, and certain gritty charm that has allowed it to be watchable after almost 50 years. Now, we come to today's version of Hellraiser, and honestly, I wouldn't be comparing these two movies if not for the confusing soft reboot title, but let's talk about it, and spoilers are coming, so fair warning. I should start by saying that Hellraiser is about 30 minutes longer than the original, which sits at a brisk 90 minutes, so we can only hope that it's extra time well spent. We begin in Serbia, where an ominous woman is making a side street deal in broad daylight to purchase what we assume is the cube. She then finds herself in a sex club, seducing a young man to come home with her, a throwback to Julia's role in the original. This leads the young man to a decorated chamber where the cube sits on a pedestal. And here we are, treated to our first helping of exposition, a common thread in this movie that makes it more work to watch. So not only is it weird that this young man showed up in this chamber for some old lady sex, and instead of the woman being there, he's now talking to a random man and doing a puzzle box, yet he does not even for a moment question anything. It is the film communicating to us that logical processing does not matter in this movie. These are just hurdles to get to the blood and violence we are hungry for. The young man is stabbed by the puzzle box, then ripped apart by chains as the older gentleman gives penance, and we cut to the title. The next scene, we're introduced to some characters having rough sex, because sex is a theme from the original, so let's have more of it to start off, and we get a funny scene after where they come out from the bedroom to see their flatmates are setting up for dinner while listening to them have rough sex. We are introduced to the main characters in this one scene, and all of them have names that I don't remember, so we're just going to call them based on their function in the plot. So we have the main girl who clearly has issues. She's disheveled and gritty, surrounded by upper middle class graces in the form of her roommate, her brother, and her brother's boyfriend. Now we're introduced to the driving drama of these characters as they sit and have tedious dramatic conversations about what the main character is going to do to get her life back on track. There is an obvious frustration with her and her brother, as her brother is trying to guide her to a better life, while she is a toxic douchebag constantly trying to victimize herself and look for people to support her generally selfish and short-sighted behavior. I'm not sure if this is a theme or anything, it's literally her character.
Is that supposed to be a stab?
It's not.
And I feel like it's commentary on toxic people in general, but let's just say it's supposed to be a point of interest and motivation for future moments. Again, all of this is told to us in character scenes, so we have a nice portion of exposition to help us care about what happens next. We have next an awkward edit leading to the main girl now in the apartment of her man friend who is giving her rough sex at the beginning, and she continues to talk about this drama with her brother to him. He then decides to goad her into breaking into an old container yard where they find the cube. So again, here the movie is reinforcing that our main character is an immature, toxic person because she only really wants to be free from other people telling her she sucks, and thinks that the money she might make by helping her non-boyfriend bank friend steal something is her ticket to being free to continue being a terrible person. This is the information that is driving the plot forward. I should point out here the stark contrast in storytelling between the two movies. The original Hellraiser showed us scenes where ideas played out, and this new one is telling us ideas and then leading us to the next scene by telling us where it is going to be. These are completely different storytelling techniques, and one of them actually lends to a fun viewing experience. So they have the cube now, but our main girl's nighttime romping arouses her brother from his bed with his boyfriend, which is super important to the filmmaking that we explicitly announce this character is gay, and yay for us normalizing it. But honestly, there is a lot of time being dedicated to minute details that feed into a dramatic fight between characters that doesn't really resonate with any themes, so it's not making that extra 30 minutes of screen time feel warranted. The siblings fight loudly and he kicks her out of the apartment. It's incredibly overacted and dramatic and awkward, and all drenched in a desperate need to compel the plot forward. For the record, around this time in the original movie, we are fully informed on all the subtle dramas going on between the characters without anyone shouting them at one another. We have all the stakes planted in getting to Frank's resurrection, which is again one of the greatest sequences ever put on film. In this reboot, we are witnessing sloppy CW drama unfold. The now homeless main girl is in a park at night playing with the cube and violating her sobriety a bit, and at one point the cube opens up and we get our first horror sequence where she sees the Cenobites, and we initiate Act 2 where she is now the vessel of the Cenobites, and everyone that she chooses with the cube becomes another victim to the Cenobites' horrors. The scenes with the Cenobites are actually a high point of the movie. They are creepy and give us new images of the terror waiting in the alternate dimension. Interesting body mutilation and creature designs add an interesting twist to the lore of the cube. The sequence concludes with her brother finding her at the park all zonked out, accidentally stabbing himself with the cube, and then off camera being stolen into the other dimension. This propels new motivation in the main girl as she is finding it hard to explain what happened, since everyone thinks she's just doped up on some drugs, and in her frustration she runs back to her bang boy toy and they bang again, because sex is a theme. After they satisfy the movie's themes, they have a belabored conversation about the cube, because the cube is important, and the main plot we follow is now a detective movie about trying to learn about the cube. Can we go back to the original real quick, and can you tell me which one is more interesting? In the original Hellraiser, it's about Julia's dark lusting for this man, and we follow her on a destructive path, sacrificing her own family, seducing men, and killing. Or the new Hellraiser, where a shitty girl's brother gets victimized by her shitty life choices, and then she wants to learn why by doing detective work. I cannot make this decision for you, so you're gonna have to let me know which plot sounds better in the comments below. Anyway, they expedition dump on us that the original owner of the container yard is the older lady from the beginning that is in a hospital, and so they go visit her, and they kind of just get into the hospital because this movie is happening in a vacuum, and so we just need to get people into the room so their mouths will do the rest of the explaining, which is why I watch movies, because I like having shit explained to me by stoic faces. Either way, the old lady they talk to is dying of lung cancer, and she just kind of already knows what they are talking about and says some cryptic stuff about the other guy from the beginning of the movie, and all of it is just kind of noise that leads us to the old lady grabbing the cube, the main girl trying to grab the cube back, and then the old lady getting cut by the cube in the scuffle. So just a really messy scene that ends with the old lady getting taken by the Cenobites and thusly continuing the destructive path left by the main character. It's also a helpful reminder not to grab cubes from strangers. It should also be reiterated that this scary sequence with the old lady is more of the good stuff this movie offers, with interesting Cenobite designs and fun lighting and good horror, but getting to it was like walking upstairs and stubbing your toe on every step. Afterwards, we are treated to a brilliant filmmaking sequence where the characters get on a MacBook Pro and Google shit, only to then take precious moments to shout what they Googled to one another in desperation. Now, I don't know if I should spend a lot of time dissecting one of the laziest horror movie tropes ever invented since the debut of personal computers in film, but let's just say it's a very disappointing crutch for a story to rely on. Only the most generic and lazy of scripts take this sequence and rely on it heavily to pivot the characters from one moment to the next. Smart movies do this briefly and quickly. Genius movies make this the pursuit of the entire movie, i.e. The Ring, and really bad movies make the conversation seem very important and spend way too many minutes trying to escalate the tone of the conversation to create an atmosphere of dread, but usually it's just boring and tedious to sit through. I think one movie that uses this crutch correctly is The Conjuring. They only really rely on researching for a brief moment to deduce this is a witch before moving on to the scares and the fun part of that movie. This boils down to a choice of the director, and it's, do I treat my audience like they are stupid? Hellraiser thinks we are very stupid so far. Either way, the research points our characters to the mansion of the evil guy from the beginning, and we are treated to an exceptionally long sequence of her driving to the mansion, breaking in, and then reading stuff that is neatly written for her about everything that is going on. I would like to stop here and talk about cubes. Cubes are interesting art, fun geometry, and I totally understand anyone obsessed with models about the fourth dimension and all the varieties of cubes that exist. I enjoy the movie Cube, about a group of people stuck in a giant Rubik's Cube full of deadly traps, and they have to use math to escape. But what I particularly like about cubes is how understated they are, a message clearly missing from the direction of this movie. Everything is cube. Cubes are everywhere. Look at this fucking mansion covered in this outer shell of cube. Look at this window. Look at this container. Look at all the square things in the whole fucking world, because people making this clearly don't understand subtle things. The original Hellraiser introduces the cube, but then we don't see it for another 40 minutes of screen time, because the original Hellraiser was about characters and humanity, and it wanted to establish some of those things before it became about this object. Meanwhile, in this reboot, the whole fucking thing is drenched in cube. The whole crux of the plot and all the characters' motivations are centered around the cube. All is about the cube, and it becomes so tiresome, and we aren't even halfway through the movie. Someone call Ice Cube or Cuba Gooding Jr., or let's give the director some cubes of melon to satiate this apparent caveman's lust over that shape. sleep, meanwhile missing the most important thing about filmmaking: interest. I cannot be interested in something that is being painfully obvious. There is no mysticism to the cube because it's literally stabbing me in the face with how it works, and I have to sit and watch a moron fumble about while I sympathize with her bad hair day. It's not fun. Stop with the cube obsession. It really oversaturates the movie and makes it not cool. I have no control over this, so it's just gonna annoy me for the rest of the video, and we'll all be okay, but let me know how you feel about cubes in the comments below. So now we are in Act 3, I suppose. We're in at the house after a nightmare sequence with the main girl. She's awoken back to reality, and all of her friends from the beginning of the movie are there now, giving the lame excuse that they talked to her boy toy and he told them where she was going, so they all decided to show up because none of them have lives outside of this narcissistic troll of a woman, and all of it is in service of people need to die in this movie. But let's just move on from this incredible leap in logic so that we can enjoy the things that do happen that are fun. They decide to split up and explore the house because why not? They're breaking and entering. Why not Scooby-Doo the shit out of this place while you're there? Dumb roommate with the weird accent uncovers secret doors that she haphazardly gets locked into, and here we catch the first glimpse of the very alive owner of the home who has this weird apparatus stuck in his chest, fiddling with the cube, and then stabbing the dumb roommate in the back with it. After a bunch of yelling and erratic bullshit happens, they decide to try and get their friend to a hospital. Even though her lungs are probably punctured and she'll bleed out, we are treated to a nice sequence where we get to see a good view of the Cenobite friends, and they are all pretty glorious, except for a missing element of slime that made Frank so grotesque to witness. In all seriousness, I do like the extreme levels of flaying, but the costumes do look very much like latex outfits with designs on them, and there's a very strange cleanliness to all of it. But I do like that we get clean looking images of this horrifying idea, and it's all in good fun, so this is the part of the movie I think works the best, and I love seeing them attempt the imagery we get from the Cenobites. The awkward roommate with the weird accent is stolen from the back seat of a vehicle our main characters are fleeing in, but they can't escape because the Cenobites are also trapping them in the property by making them go in a loop over and over, and the confused cast is forced to go back into the mansion. This is a weird ability that's never quite explored after this, but a neat psychological trick as well as we ramp up to the climax. Everyone at this point is getting fucked up, bitten, bloodied, and it's quite clear that things are not going well as people continue to die around the main character. At this point, it would be good to discuss the psychology of the characters since it kind of plays into how poor the writing of this movie is. Now, around the same time in the original Hellraiser, Kirsty is in the psych ward and she's completely and newly exposed to the insanity of her situation and overwhelmed by it. But in the new Hellraiser, our character has literally been studying and obsessing over the presence of this cube and its powers, as well as having a background in trauma in general, being under duress her entire life, and I would argue her mental state should be a little less I don't know what's going on and a little bit more like oh shit, I fucked up because I could have figured out a lot of this already without putting other people's lives at risk. So her portrayal of being completely inept is not really working here, and it just reinforces what a terrible character she is. See, even Kirsty, despite being completely in over her head and has little time to conceptualize every trauma going on around her, is forced to act, and her actions follow a reasonable shock response to the violence and terror. Whereas here, the main character is a buffoon and can't even take basic directions from characters around her that are semi-coherent.
Give me your belt. What? Give me your fucking belt!
The brother's boyfriend seems to be taking the position as the only one with the right idea, as it's revealed that her boy toy bang buddy is actually the one guiding this whole situation, as it was his job given to him by the homeowner who has a nefarious plan to save himself. We learn this by, you guessed it, more scenes where two characters explain everything to us. So not much to say, it's just sort of prolonging the inevitable moment when the movie ends. What happens for the rest of the movie is a long sequence of people running around and getting bloodied up from moment to moment as they try to get out of being at the mercy of the Cenobites. I wanted to point out a few moments that really made me hate this movie. One major one is this moment here, where our main character drops the cube because she bumps into a wall, and then proceeds to victimize herself as an excuse for being really stupid. And it is then complemented by the remaining gay boyfriend shuffling over and putting his life at risk since he's been marked as a sacrifice to the cube, and then failing to find it on the floor. There is literally a painful moment or two to dedicated to this beat, and it's literally the only reason I'm highlighting it. The director of this movie felt it was so important to stress how lost the cube was in that moment that we have it pointed out to us by the editing, dialogue, and performances, and it's a seriously questionable choice in what to focus on in the middle of a climax unfolding. Oops, I dropped it. Let me help you look. I can't find it either. It's right there. I don't see it. Where is it? I don't know. While demonic creatures from another dimension are right behind you waiting to tear your flesh apart, the movie's really convoluted at this point, so let's just skip to the ending. The shitty main protagonist decides to sacrifice her fake boyfriend, who is betraying her this whole time, and save her brother's boyfriend from being fully sacrificed. And I'm happy to say the gory, fleshy, ripping final minutes really do satisfy what I was watching the movie for in the first place, the body horror. So I'm happy to say that this does provide what was advertised. The main bad guy behind it all gets his wish, but it's a trick because they just kind of flay him in floaty heaven space. The shitty protagonist decides to not try to save her brother, making all the bloody nightmare she experienced completely irrelevant, and only making decisions to take care of herself while everyone that gave a slight shit about her dies a horrible death. The movie ends on the mutilated body of the bad guy getting ripped up, but he seems to kind of like it? So that's how that ends. So we have in front of us a very simple example of showing versus telling in cinema. The original Hellraiser shows us scenes that compile together to give us a tale of morality, examining the evil human side of the real world, and teases us with the ideas about the alternative dimensions that exist that feed into the cravings and allure of pleasures, and is full of interpretations and details that provide a haunting lesson about our humanity. The new Hellraiser tells us a bunch of boring bullshit about how shitty millennials can be, and is made for fan service to the original Hellraiser. While being a good-looking visual update to the franchise, it is in dire need of a competent screenwriter and a better director who actually gives a shit about filmmaking if it ever hopes to get close to the majesty of its original creation. This is probably the longest video I've ever made, so thank you very much for watching it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like more content, I am live on Twitch 3 days a week. I love talking about movies, so if anything strikes me, I'll make another one. Let me know in the comments if you like this. I don't know. Enjoy the rest of your days. Goodbye.